Rich, please join me on stage. Rich Fruehauf is not only the Chief Sustainability Officer of U.S. Steel, but he's also the Chief Strategy Officer of U.S. Steel, which is a statement in itself. So he's responsible for the company's entire strategy, and he's also responsible for sustainability, which, as you'll hear, is unexpectedly a huge priority. You know, we hear people badmouth heavy industry a lot, but in fact, there's a lot going on, which we're very eager to hear about, and I'm excited that you're here with us. So first of all, tell us what U.S. Steel does, what kind of steel it produces, for what kind of purposes, and a little bit about the journey you've been on.
Well, thank you, David. So as you noted, I have kind of a clunky title, Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer, but that's very intentional because our strategy and sustainability are intertwined. We can talk a little bit about that. But you know, U.S. Steel, been around since 1901. Some names you've probably heard. Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan created the company.
We've heard of those people, yeah.
Yeah, you're right. 120 years ago. You know, a lot of firsts, first billion-dollar enterprise, first company with a code of conduct, invented the phrase safety first and a commitment to safety. And, you know, I think we have an audio or a visual I'd like to show everybody. But when you think of steel, right, we make products that go into your cars, your appliances, washing machines, pipelines, yellow goods, which are, you know, earth-moving equipment, farm equipment, lots of things. So which one of those pictures is a steel mill? Just ask the audience.
Yeah, anybody, what do you think?
They're both steel mills, right? It's a trick question, right? They're both steel mills. So probably most people, when they think of steel, they think of that, the one on the left, that's a blast furnace. That's the way you've traditionally made steel. Very carbon intensive, right? You take coke, which is purified coal, you mix it with iron ore, that, quote, reduces, if you ever cooked a sauce, right? You reduce it. That's what you're doing. You're reducing the iron. Comes out the bottom as liquid iron. We put it into another process with oxygen, turns it into steel, right? Traditionally how you make steel. Well, in the United States, actually only about 1/3 of the steel made in the United States is made that way. In Europe, actually 2/3 is made that way. And that's important because the other way, which is that blue building, that's a facility called Big River Steel. That's another way of making steel. That's called an electric arc furnace facility. And in that facility, we take scrap steel, old cars, old washing machines, old bridges, old girders. We chop it up and we blast it with electricity, renewable electricity, right? Solar, or I used to work at Westinghouse. I think nuclear is okay. Whatever you want to say about nuclear, there's no carbon emissions, right? And you can recycle that steel and make the same kinds of products you make the other way. It's about a 75% reduction in greenhouse gases if you make it with an electric arc furnace. And if you use
that is huge.
It's huge, right? That's right. I mean, globally, steel's maybe 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions, right? We're a so-called hard-to-abate sector, but we're also necessary for the energy transition. You can't have an electric vehicle without an electric motor. You need a special kind of steel to make an electric motor, non-grain-oriented steel. We are building a facility at Big River to make about 200,000 tons of non-grain-oriented electrical steel, which you absolutely need, or else you can't have an EV.
And that will be made electrically for the use in electrical equipment.
Correct, correct. Made through this process where we're recycling the steel using renewable or nuclear power, so you can really drive down the carbon intensity of the steel, and you can make the things that you need. You also need something called grain-oriented electrical steel, another type of steel. If you want to have charging stations and transformers, you need steel for that. So we recognize in our strategy, which we call Best for All, that we need to be part of the solution. The solution in part is improving the production route, reducing the greenhouse gases that we make using electric arc furnaces instead of, and more electric arc furnaces. We currently have about 3.3 million tons of steel making made through that electric arc furnace process. We've invested to build another 3 million tons. So probably by about mid-2024, we should have about 6 million tons of steel making through this electric arc furnace process. And we can really drive down the emissions intensity. We have a 2050 net zero goal. Using these proven technologies, we can really put a dent in our greenhouse gas emissions and still deliver things like, you know, if you're going to buy an EV, wouldn't you want to have, in addition to the non-grain-oriented electrical steel, we can reduce the carbon intensity, the amount of greenhouse gases emitted in the superstructure of the car. So these are things we're delivering for our customers.
And presumably companies like GM and Ford, who are your customers, want you to do that so they can help meet their own goals in terms of their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions.
Absolutely. We've seen increasing interest from our automotive customers, from appliance customers. We announced a product line called VERDX, VERD for green, and X is our stock ticker, to make these low carbon.
X is your stock ticker. That just shows how long you've been around.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So we are absolutely hearing from the customers. They want this kind of low carbon intensity steel in the appliance industry, the automotive industry, and even in some other, like construction. People want to know that the steel that they're getting is low carbon intensity steel, and we're delivering it. Our stakeholders want it.
So why is Europe still behind the U.S. in making this transition to electric steel making?
That's a great question. I personally think it's in part because of the electricity rates in Europe. A lot of what you need for, obviously, the kind of facility on the right, that electric arc furnace, uses lots of electricity. So European electricity rates aren't as cost competitive as they are here in the United States. And that's been, I think, one of the things that's held Europe back. And you need a lot of scrap steel, which we have a lot of here in the United States. It's very circular. Steel loses none of its properties, no matter how many times you recycle it.
So steel is one of the most recycled materials there is.
Absolutely.
Which is fantastic.
Absolutely.
So your industry is contributing 8% of global emissions, which you willingly acknowledge because you're working on it so hard, which is amazing. Earlier today, there was a little interaction between one of our speakers and a colleague of yours in the audience, because the speaker had said that it's very difficult in many industries for one company to step out ahead and take on the additional costs of doing the right thing when it comes to emissions and sustainability, because they fear that they will be outcompeted by those who don't make that move. And your colleague said from the audience that that really isn't any longer true in steel. Would you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are commercial incentives to produce these kinds of steels, to change the way you produce steel. I mentioned VERDX. Big River is the first LEED certified steel mill in the United States. It is Daimler's global sustainable supplier of the year. All products, not just steel, across.
So you're getting more business by doing it.
You absolutely are. And I think at some point it's going to become table stakes. Right now it's a scarce asset. And customers who have their own their own greenhouse gas reduction targets are coming to us and they're saying, you're part of the supply chain. How do you green your supply chain? Help us. And that's how we can help them. We can help them help their customers with more sustainable solutions. So the other thing too, though, I mean, it's a fair point in terms of what we're seeing in Europe. In Europe, you're seeing public-private partnerships. You're seeing the government investing in the transition of their steel industry. And we're seeing that in Canada as well. We're not seeing it yet here in the United States. I mean, direct funding of the transition from this blast furnace technology to the electric arc furnace. We've seen numerous announcements across Europe and Germany and France and Spain of direct government support from national governments and from the EU to help with that transition. And I think the Europeans recognize that steel is critical. It's critical for the energy transition. It's critical, as we see maybe the onshoring of industry. And by the way, there's a sustainability benefit to that too. If you don't have those global supply chains, a lot less emissions moving stuff across oceans if you're just moving it by rail a few hundred miles rather than thousands of miles across the ocean. But I think Europe has recognized that you need a robust steel industry. It's part of manufacturing, and there's a sustainability benefit to it.
Do you think the steel industry will become more localized as a result of that transportation cost issue and the ability to move to these much less polluting electric plants?
Steel has always had a sort of local presence, in part because of the logistics costs. I mean, these products we make, a coil of steel is tons, right? So we're one of the biggest customers of barges, of lake freighters, of the railroads. So logistics costs have always been important to the steel industry. But I do think localization helps with so many things. We mine, melt, and manufacture steel in the United States. It helps reduce energy insecurity. It reduces the risk of national security, reduces complex supply chains. So, it improves your sustainability performance. I think that's the direction the industry is heading.
Interesting. Now, on the other side, in the old steel side, you are hugely vertically integrated. You own mines in Minnesota where you get iron ore and you take it all the way to steel.
Right.
So for that part of the industry, which is still the blast furnace technology, which we still need some version of that because we can't only recycle steel, we have to make new steel. What's the sustainability path there?
Yeah, so I think you're exactly right. So in Minnesota, we mine iron ore, a rock called taconite, and we produce iron pellets, FeO2. That's what goes into the blast furnace. And you're exactly right. You're always going to need a certain amount of that. So even though steel is circular, there's always a little bit of loss in the cycle, right? Because not everything gets recycled. And so you're always going to need a little bit of new steel in there. And then you also need, for that electric arc furnace route, when you think about scrap, right? And not many people think about scrap. I don't know how many people thought about scrap today.
We're thinking about it more right now than usual.
Yeah. So, but when somebody takes a car and they crush it up, well, there's all this copper in there, right? Copper wiring goes into the car. Well, that copper's bad for steel. It makes steel brittle, cracks. So you always need to put in sort of a little bit of extra fresh iron. And that's where you hear things like direct reduced iron, which can be made today with natural gas, but it is absolutely technically feasible to use hydrogen. So when you hear things like steel and hydrogen, that's where, when you're reducing the iron, one of the paths forward is potentially to use hydrogen instead of methane to reduce the iron, take these little iron units and put them in with the scrap. You need to put a little bit in there, and you can keep producing top quality steel, very low carbon intensity steels. So for our mining sector, we announced about 3 months ago, we're going to start producing these direct reduced iron pellets. You have to concentrate them a little bit more. So another step toward getting that part of the business to be more sustainable. But we're also doing things like, while the electric arc furnace technology is very proven, it's been around for decades, the blast furnaces, people talk about carbon capture and sequestration. We have partnerships with other companies, and this is where public, private, and collaborative approaches are needed. We're not an energy company. We need to partner with energy companies, those who are going to capture carbon, sequester it, but we also need to develop the technology to actually capture the carbon off of a blast furnace, transport it to a place where it's going to be permanently sequestered, or the ultimate win is if somebody can come up in there. I know we've talked to a number of companies, if you can take that carbon and put it to a beneficial use instead of just pumping it down into an old oil or gas well.
So you're making progress on that. So how soon would you say it'll be before we have no blast furnaces of the type we see today?
Globally, it'll be a long, long time because China and other countries continue to actually build those.
Build new ones?
Yes, they do. Yeah. Now, here in the United States, I don't think a blast furnace has been built in 30 or 40 years. So I think the path forward in the United States and North America is highly unlikely to see new blast furnaces and sort of a gradual falling away of the blast furnace. And part of what's happened is historically, the electric arc furnaces started off making sort of the low end of the spectrum with steel products. So things that like, if you know what rebar is, right, goes into concrete, not very sophisticated product. But the technology keeps advancing, an innovation story, where these electric arc furnaces continue to be able to make more and more sophisticated steel products that previously were only able to be made by the blast furnace.
So Daimler can buy them, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think, I'm a big believer that eventually money, time, engineering, virtually any kind of steel product will be able to be made through the electric arc furnace route, which then means, you need the blast furnace or direct reduced iron for that extra iron unit, but I don't think there's a long-term, where you see new blast furnaces in North America. I doubt you'll see that many in Europe, or if any. The Europeans, as I said, are moving toward electric arc furnaces. It's some of the other parts of the world where there probably still will be more blast furnaces built.
So we've touched on this already, but I'd like you to talk a little more about how the effort to decarbonize changes your relationship with all your stakeholders. I mean, how is it received generally in your industry, among your investors, among your customers more broadly, et cetera?
I think it's generally, we're conscious of our commitment to our stakeholders. Certainly the investors want to see us decarbonize. As I mentioned, the customers do. And, over the last 2 years, I think it's just kind of shot up astronomically.
What has shot up?
The desire for decarbonization.
Oh, I'm glad you think so.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I in my role, spend a lot of time dealing with investors. And we usually have at the end of the year, November, December, is when we reach out to big investors. What are your concerns? What are your thoughts, et cetera? And I would say over the last 2 years, we've seen a lot more focus on what are you doing to decarbonize. And as I mentioned on the customer side, we've also seen that in the past 18 months since we've launched our Verdicts brand. I think we've gotten huge interest. Again, Europe has led, but it's now migrating to North America. So again, Daimler recognizes the value of Big River, but now we're seeing some of the more U.S.-centric companies saying, "Oh yeah, we want to go green too. We want to decarbonize, and how can you help us do that?" So we're seeing it from the customers, from the investors, certainly the employees. We have what we call employee resource groups. They're like affinity groups. We launched our sustainability ERG earlier this year. Tremendous interest. The employees are very engaged.
I think a lot of people are probably surprised to hear what U.S. Steel is doing. And there is time for a question or so from the audience if anybody has one. Oh, right here in the front. We may not even have a mic, but just shout it out and I'll repeat it.
Your Verdicts, is that a separate brand? And can you maybe speak a little bit more to that?
Talk about Verdicts as a
Yeah,
brand,
yeah.
how it differs from the rest of the company.
It is a separate brand in the sense that it can be very similar or identical grade, but made through this different process route. So you get less greenhouse gases emitted to get the same grade of steel than you would if you made it through the blast furnace route. And so for the customers who say, "Hey, that's really important to me. I want a low greenhouse gas emissions intensity product," that's an offering we're able to give them.
I don't know if we have a mic, but we should have mics every session. You shout out your question. Tell us who you are also, please. Right.
Reducing excavation and also reducing waste materials. And so I wonder if you could talk about how much that's appreciated or maybe underappreciated by government policies and also your...
Great. A long question for done without a mic. So basically the point is it's not just about decarbonization. It's about all the other benefits that come with being more sustainable and particularly reducing waste, reducing wasteful inputs, et cetera.
Yeah, well,
How is that appreciated in the policy realm?
I don't know that it is that well appreciated, to be honest with you. But one thing, I've been in the steel business now for 8 years. One thing, the steel industry is like farmers. You know how like the farmer is always trying to find a way to do something without having to spend a lot of money, right? Always inventing some steel. It's always about recycling, keeping costs down. A lot of the byproducts of steelmaking have for decades been used for other uses. So, we try to reduce waste, but then the waste that we do produce, for example, slag, which is one of the byproducts, it goes into aggregates for roads, right? That's what's used as sort of part of the road bed, right? We recycle the gases that are produced in the steelmaking process, and you can recycle those. So steel always is focused on recycling, reusing. I don't know that policymakers fully comprehend that, but we do talk about that in our sustainability report, not just what we're doing on greenhouse gases, but other emissions, how we recycle, we reuse. And, we have other material factors. Our materiality assessment we just completed, we're one of the highest, really the top priority of our company in our materiality assessment is safety. U.S. Steel invented the phrase safety first. We take that very seriously. In fact, our CEO right now is out in California receiving an award from the National Safety Council because of our safety performance. So we look at sustainability more than just climate change. It's across, DE&I, it's innovation, it's safety, it's obviously environmental performance, greenhouse gas emissions. We take a very broad view.
Yeah, I don't think most people realized U.S. Steel was the kind of company you're describing. We do have a mic now if we have one last question. Do we have it? Okay, and please, Robin Raskin, Techonomy contributor. I hope it's a good question. Take the mic. You don't need to identify yourself because I just did it.
No pressure. You did that for me. So do you lose any sleep that there will be a post-steel era? I mean, we're looking at new replacements for concrete and other building materials. Surely there have to be new materials. And is U.S. Steel working on them?
I mean materials to succeed. So get rid of steel entirely? You're wondering if that could ever happen?
Well, I'll never.
You may not want that.
I probably don't, but I won't say, you never say never, but it's really hard at this point in time to see as far out as you can look and say you won't need steel. So for example, as I mentioned, for making an electric vehicle motors, you need steel that goes into the motor because of the magnetic properties. So you can't use aluminum. And I used to work at Alcoa. I understand a little bit about aluminum. There's some things that are better about steel than aluminum. There's some things about aluminum that are better than steel. But as I said, steel is really a tremendous material, and the fact that you can just keep recycling it over and over and over and it doesn't lose the properties is very unique among basic materials.
It's pretty amazing. I bet, how many people here are surprised by what they learned about U.S. Steel today? Yeah, I was when we had our prep call, I got to tell you. It's really not what you think about heavy industry. So it's wonderful to have you here. It's wonderful the things you're doing at your company, and hope to have you on stage with us again sometime soon.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Rick. Really good. Okay, we're going to take a picture.